Hey, good evening, everyone. I'm so glad you all stayed. I know it's been a long day, and sometimes I talk too much, so I'll try not to do that tonight. I would thank Dr. Coles for letting me come. I want to thank Alex Newman, who suggested me. I feel for you kind of like those people who were invited to a steak dinner, and they serve Salisbury steak. Technically, it's still steak, but it's not quite as nice. And so I'm trying to do my best to fill in for Alex and be able to provide some information for you tonight that might help us understand a little bit more about how we got to the situation where we are now. And so I am Ceasar LeFlore with the Illinois Family Institute. Just very quickly what we do, we are one of those faith-based organizations. We're a 501c3 nonprofit out of Tinley Park, Illinois, and our mission is to support family and life. We're unapologetically Christian, we're unapologetically pro-life, and we operate from a biblical worldview. And we actually believe that there needs to be some kind of intersection between our faith and public policy. And so we believe that our faith, the things that we believe, ought to be influenced in what our public policy would unfold. We also have a 501c4, an action arm. And what we try to do there is try to support, encourage, and get pro-life, pro-family, righteous people elected into office. And if you know anything about Illinois, you know we need that more than anything else. A couple of years ago, we met Alex Newman and Joanne Reese, and they had this project, Public School Exit. And we have been praying about that. We've been struggling with what was going on in our school systems. We saw that our school systems were failing our children, and so we actually started looking at that more closely, and we decided that the only answer is to get our children out of these failing schools. Someone told me, said, hey, the public schools, the government schools, is no place for children, and especially no place for Christian children. So we looked into it, and we became a part of Public School Exit. I am now the state director for that program. We have regional directors all over the state. We have a scholarship fund where we're raising $1 million a year to be able to give scholarship opportunities to underprivileged children to get out of the government schools and get into private schools, and also to get grants to help plant Christian private schools in Illinois. So that's what we do, that's what we're about. And so tonight I'm going to be able to share some information with you about when students' futures matter. Students' futures matters. I read this on Facebook. It said it took the Marxists 80 years to capture academia and the public school system so as to deconstruct Western culture and destroy the family. It says homeschooling can recapture our civilization and values in one generation. No political group, party, or solution is this powerful. We highly recommend homeschooling as our first priority. We think that every parent has a responsibility to take the education of their children back away from the government and take the responsibility of making sure they're raised. We don't look at it as just being education. Our children should be given wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. And as Christians, we believe those things we find in the Word of God. So we prefer homeschooling, but we recognize that there needs to be some other options as well. And so we promote homeschool co-ops, micro schools, and right now we're really putting a lot of pressure on churches and pastors to take these buildings that you guys have, open these buildings up, make them available so that people can come in and do homeschool projects there. I want churches to go into the business of education because our number one responsibility as Christians is to make disciples of Jesus Christ. And there's no better way to do that than making disciples of our children. And so that's what we are recommending with people. Now, I'm going to start out with a quote from somebody who was a hero for me when I was growing up. Back in my more Afrocentric days, I started looking for authors and writers who would say something to speak to me as a black man trying to make it in America. And I came across Carter G. Woodson. Now, Carter G. Woodson was a historian. He was an educator. He was an author. Actually, he's the founder of Black History Month. But he wrote a book in 1933 called The Miseducation of the Negro. The Miseducation of the Negro. That struck me because I actually thought that our school system were not really helping the black community. It was hurting the black community. And so I started reading this book, and Carter G. Woodson said some very interesting things. He said, during the period from the end of the American Civil War to the early 1930s, the U.S. education system controlled and oppressed black students students rather than help them achieve their potential. So now what he is saying is that at the end of slavery, during the emancipation, after emancipation, and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, you had these 4 million people here, these 4 million African-American people here, that society didn't really see as equal, and society thought that what are we going to do with these people? They'll become a burden on society since they are no longer utility to us from working, so what are we going to do? They came up with some options. How about recolonization? How about we send them all back to Africa? Well, you couldn't do that. And so they had to come up with an idea of what to do with these people. Now, a couple of political theories around the world was emerging. Eugenics was coming up at that time, but those African Americans who found their way to make it into the school system, Carter G. Woodson noted that they were using the school system to oppress African Americans. So one thing the school system was to African Americans was it oppressed them. It kept them in an inferior state. It kept them from realizing their potential because a lot of people didn't want them to be able to compete with them. And then he also said this: Black people of his day were being culturally indoctrinated rather than taught in American schools. This conditioning causes black people to become dependent and to seek out inferior places in the greater society of which they are a part. So now he says the school system was oppressing and controlling. Now he says the school system is indoctrinating them, turning them into something else that they're really not, teaching them a culture that doesn't really belong to them, making them believe something about themselves that's really not true. So not only was it oppressing, it was also controlling. But here's the one that really hit me. He says, when you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it for himself. Carter G. Woodson was saying that we can control what a person thinks, we can control how he behaves. And so if we manipulate his thought process, not only about the way he thinks, but the way he thinks of himself, then we don't have to try to work hard to keep him subdued. He will subdue himself just based on how he was taught to think. Margaret Mead said children must be taught how to think, not what to think. And I think that's vitally important because the one thing that we're missing now in society that we can see so obvious is that we don't have people who think. We have people who are emotionally driven, but they don't think. Critical thinking is lost because it's not being taught in our schools. And the reason why is because the schools is not for education, it's for indoctrination. And so they are telling us what it is that we need to think. So I'm going to start out with this and then I'm going to prove it in my presentation tonight. It says globalists, utopians, socialists, totalitarians, and the UN are using public schools to undermine American ideals of freedom, individual liberties, and Christianity. And there's a lot of groups that I would attach to that list of people who are operating in our schools. Black Lives Matter, there's a lot of organizations, a lot of ideas that are being transmitted through the public schools, the government schools, and this is the result of what we get. So let me tell you about why we've gotten here. The individuals, they're people who saw history and saw what the school system was accomplishing. Let me say this, the school system is not broken. It's operating exactly as it was designed to work, exactly as it was built to work. And so here's an example of how they saw over history how to influence people and how to get your agenda across through the school system. In 1992, the UN hosted the Summit to Save the Planet in Rio de Janeiro. And is that going to come back? Okay. And at that summit, they introduced Agenda 21. These were goals that were going to be met by 2021 and 2030. Agenda 2030. But it says Agenda 21 proposes an array of actions which are intended to be implemented by every person on earth. Now think about this. Here's a few people, a handful of people have gotten together and said that they know better what's best for everybody on the planet. This group of people have come together, they've talked, they've figured it out, and they say this is what the whole planet needs. Effective execution of Agenda 21 will require profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. So now they're saying we know what's best for them, and now we're going to have to change everybody on the planet. Not just everybody in your community, not just everybody in your community, every person on the planet has to be reoriented. Think about that. They're setting this goal that everybody has to have their mind changed to fall in line with what we, the small elite group of individuals, think is best for the world. So they set this proposal in place and they said, okay, it's got to be executed. But how? How are we going to be able to change the entire world? Chapter 36 of Agenda 21 says this: education is critical for promoting sustainable development. Now, what sustainable development is just what somebody was talking about earlier today. This whole promise of a utopia. If you fall in line with me and fall behind me, we're going to make everything wonderful for you. We're going to be able to have no poverty on the planet, and there'll be no hungry people, and everybody will be good and healthy. Everybody will be this way if you fall in line. Promising something that they cannot deliver, yet determined to do it anyway. But this is what they said: both formal and non-formal education are indispensable to changing people's attitudes. Formal and non-formal education, indispensable. It is also critical for achieving environmental and ethical awareness, values, skills, and behaviors consistent with sustainable goals. I'm going to ask you to just think about that for a moment. Here these individuals have come up with a plan, and they're going to impose this plan on everybody on the planet. And the way that they're going to do that is they're going to make sure that they use the education system the way people before them did, and I'm going to take you through a historical review of that. So here we have this history of decline in American education. How did we get here? How did we get involved in this race to the bottom? It's not a race to the top. It's a race to the bottom. How did we get here? Well, I want to point out some things in history that kind of make sense of see why we're here today the way we are. These individuals who are Proposition 21 and 30, they look back at history and they knew the same thing that we know, and they just reproduced what they had seen. So there's some people I want to introduce you to, and then there's some ideas I want you to know. Before the Civil War, for almost 250 years, the education of children, first in England, North American colonies, and then in the United States of America, up until the Civil War, was almost an entirely private affair. If I get any of this wrong, raise your hand and say I got it wrong. Children were typically educated with homeschools and tutored, tuition charged in private schools, charitable or free private schools, semi-public or district schools, which were common schools. These neighborhood schools were controlled entirely by the parent. You'll hear me, controlled entirely by the parent, who chose and supplied textbooks and who hired and fired the teachers. Think about that. How, really? That was a time? Absolutely. Though partially funded by local taxes, these neighborhood schools were not government schools in any meaningful way. Who was controlling education then? The parents were. The parents had responsibility for their children. And if you wasn't teaching their children right, they could fire you. And they can determine what it is they wanted your children to learn. Come on back. During the peak of our U.S. education, when we were at our best, is before the government schools. In 1812, it was noticed that we were at our peak of education. Even the Europeans noticed that Americans are among the most educated in the world without government schools. Before government schools came out, Alex de Tocqueville said that we are the most enlightened people on earth. So there was a time in America where people didn't look down on us, they looked up at us and said we're the most enlightened people in the world without government schools. But then in 1820, we started seeing the seeds of statism that started coming in. So I told you before, parents had control. But now there's people who say they want to take this control away from the parent and give it to the state. The philosophical seeds of compulsion, collectivism, and statism in American schooling were first planted in the 1820s. And it had 5 primary objectives. Replace parents as the primary influencer. Recognize that? Elevate the interests of the state. Recognize that? Substitute individualism with collectivism. You know, I thought about that. I started looking around. I'm saying, why is it so few individuals? Why don't people just fall in line and do what everybody else does? You know, all of a sudden everybody got to get a tattoo, or they say everybody got to wear a plastic paper mask on your face, and everybody puts the mask on, falls right in line. We've lost our individualism, create a new kind of citizen with a focus on compliance and conformity in Americanized and Protestantized Irish Catholics. In 1840, we start seeing the beginning of the decline, because now the state is seizing control of education of our children. We start seeing a decline. Horace Mann, who was an interesting individual. Horace Mann, first of all, was an abolitionist. So I thought at first I was going to like Horace Mann. And Horace Mann, you know, in his 3 points, he did have some good intentions. Number one, he said nobody should be ignorant. He didn't want anybody to be ignorant. And he also wanted to make schools available for people of all backgrounds. But his core principle was that this education must be funded, controlled, and administered by those with public interest. And by the public interest, he meant the state. He said the state has to come up and control education. Everybody needs to get into it. And before you knew it, in 1852, we had compulsory education. Massachusetts, under Horace Mann, was the first to establish the system of comprehensive statewide compulsory schooling. Not only has the state taken education away from the parent, now they're forcing everybody, you have to send your children there. And in 1865 begins the decline of parents' rights. Wisconsin Teachers Association. Children are the property of the state. This is a teachers association. Melissa Harris Perry, anybody know who she is? Awful. And I actually watched her make this statement on one of those Lean Forward promotions. We have never invested as much in public education as we should have, because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families, and recognize that kids belong to the whole community. Once everybody has responsibility and not just the household, then we'll start making better investments. They are telling us that those children don't belong to you. Your children belong to the state. The seeds of socialism followed right after that. The post-war American schools were to serve ideological, political, not intellectual purposes. Were not to generate independent, self-governing citizens. They would produce citizens who could be governed. The intellectual development of each and every child was to be replaced by a new political value, and that is socialization. So now the states have taken control of your children away. The states have made it mandatory that your children get under their indoctrination. Now they need to start socializing your children. In 1901 is when we start seeing socialism raise its head. The role of education is to collect little plastic lumps of human dough from private households and shape them on the social kneading board. That's by Edward A. Ross, president of the American Sociological Society. You hear what he's saying? Education isn't to advance intellectual, it's to just have a bunch of clumps of human dough that they can knead on the kneading board. This is Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the United States. So now that they've socialized you, they have to break you up in classes. I heard somebody else say that earlier today about how we have broken up into classes for different purposes. He said we want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class of persons, a very much larger class of necessity, to forego the privilege of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks. Do we see what's developing here? State takes control of your citizens, your children. State starts shaping your children as they want. Now the state starts determining what they're going to do that benefits the state. The dumbing down. This is Henry Goddard. Henry Goddard is a horrible human being. Henry Goddard was also a eugenicist, the individuals who thought that there was good birth and there was bad birth. He said standardized testing would cause the lower classes to confront their biological inferiority, sort of like wearing a dunce cap. Standardized testing. He said what we're going to do is we're going to help them realize for themselves how inferior they actually are. Now remember what I said about Carter G. Woodson when he says if you can control how a man thinks, you don't have to worry about what he would do. You don't have to worry about that. If he feels that he's inferior, you don't have to make him go to those inferior position. He'll seek it for himself. Here's an individual saying, I want to show you through standardized testing how dumb you are in the lower class. This guy, M.L. Mencken. The aim of public education is not to spread enlightenment at all. It is simply to reduce as many individuals as possible to the same safe level. To breed and train a standardized citizenry to down dissent and originality. This is in our school system. This is our government school system. It's not to educate. It's not to enlighten. It's to reduce everybody to the same controllable, manageable level. John Dewey comes along in 1928. John Dewey was an individual who praised the Soviet educators for advancing the socialist new front. I heard somebody mentioning the Prussian system and others, but he went over there, he saw how they were producing these Soviet citizens. He loved it, and this is how we have this here. The teacher is always the prophet of the true God and the usherer. Now listen what he's saying. The teacher is the usherer in of the true kingdom of God. Make schools active and militant participants in creation of a new social order. They're not even trying to be deceptive. They're telling you right out what we're going to do. We're going to take your children, we're going to dumb them down, we're going to mold them in the way that we want, and then we're going to make them the participants in establishing a new social order. Well, now, I'm a Christian. I believe that God created the world, so God, therefore, is the only person that has a right to determine how we are to live in this world. But here's some individuals saying that they know better. They know better. They're going to take your children and they're going to make them tools to create a new social order. Now, socialism now is canonized because John D. Rockefeller, it's his mission statement from his first General Education Board. He says this: in our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present education conventions of intellectual and character education fade from their minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. He goes on, we shall not make these people of any of their children into men of learning or philosophers or men of science. We have not to raise up from them authors, educators, poets, or men of letters, great artists, painters, musicians, no lawyers or doctors, statesmen, politicians, and creatures of whom we have ample supply. The task is simple. We will organize and teach them in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way. Here are individuals that are saying, we're going to take them, and David Hazel, who helped me put this together, his summary of is the cabal had imperfect servants who worked for them, but they understood that they could create perfect ones by education, the general public to be educated and therefore forever enslaved to their agenda. This was their problem that they were dealing with. How could a proud, liberty-loving nation of independent families and villages be turned from its historic tradition of self-reliance and independence? By reaching the children. Listen, I heard someone once say that you cannot take liberty and freedom away from Americans. You can't take it away because we'll fight you over it. We value it. We love it. If you come in and try to take it, we'll fight you. You got to convince us to give it away. And how are we going to convince them to give it away? We're going to reach their children. And the children will grow up and turn it over willingly. The solution was to remove the control and influence on children from their families and create new, law-abiding, easy-to-regulate, obedient robots who have difficulty thinking clearly for themselves and are easy to employ. We need to finance an education system that thinks as we do. So we're following a continuum here. Is that the schools are oppressed, the schools transform, the schools just taken over by the state, they're socialized, and then they're turned into robots that would be useful for the state. 1937, this whole thing from Antonio Gramsci pointed out that there's a way to rot America from the inside. He said this: conquer the West by rotting them from the inside. The civilized world has been thoroughly saturated with Christianity for 2,000 years. Listen to this. Any country grounded in Judeo-Christian values cannot be overthrown until those roots are out. Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the New World Order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, and the media. I tell you, they got the media on lockdown. Transforming the consciousness of society. Do you see who's having more influence on society than parents, than preachers? The media, pop culture. These individuals, they're the ones, because what they try to do is separate you from parental influence. And they want to get your children as early as they possibly can. You know, they wrap these things up in what sounds like a benevolent idea. Hey, we really want your children to have early access to education. They're not doing that for you. They're doing that for them, because they want to get your children started down this road as early as they possibly can, because they want to have greater influence over your child than you do. In 1962, we started seeing the secularism that was coming. The Protestant church faced for the first time what Catholics have been doing for years, the need to educate privately. The problem was that most of their people in churches were not prepared to pay for it. Christian schools began to, from this point, emulating public counterparts and adding back faith. And now this is the seeds of the new homeschool movement that began as parents did not want public schools, but they couldn't afford private schools. And that's some of the justification I use for homeschools now. You can't afford a private school, and you don't want them to be in that. Homeschool your children. Take your children home, and we try to help people see that. Seeds of communism, communist goals. Now, this is Representative Albert Herlong. He was a representative from the state of Florida, and he had read into the congressional record the 45 communist goals from a book that was published. And number 17 of those 45 goals was what? Get control of the schools. Use them as transmission belts for socialism and communist propaganda. Get control of teachers' associations. Put the party line in textbooks. Are you seeing their strategy just play out from the very beginning, how they've been following this pattern, and they've had success with it? In 1989, do you guys recognize this guy, Robert Mueller? Robert Mueller won the UNESCO Prize for Peace Education because of the World Core curriculum. I heard somebody talking about that earlier today. And these were the key objectives of World Core. Oneness with the planet. So that's that whole climate situation. Oneness with the planet. Unity with people. Harmony with self, and evolution through time. Now listen to what Mueller says. This curriculum is the product of the United Nations, which thinks for the entire planet and humanity. Now, I don't know how insulted you got by seeing that, but I was ticked off to the highest degree of ticktivity. I made that a word. But I was insulted. But look what an educator said. The world's teacher can now have access to the soul of every man, woman, and child on the planet. Do you see how big their vision for this is? Do you see how committed they are to this? They don't want just a few. They want everybody on the planet to fall in line with them. Get into their new world order. Get into their new socialist state. This is what their desire, and they're putting this stuff into curriculum and putting it into our schools. 1992 to 2010, the World Core shell game. They renamed Common Core 4 or 5 different times. George Clinton, George Bush, George Clinton. A lot of them probably don't know who George Clinton is. They're not down with the Parliament, P-Funk, and none of that. But George H.W. Bush named it America 2000 National Education Strategy. Bill Clinton, Goals 2000, Educate America Act. George W. Bush, No Child Left Behind. And then Barack Obama just called it what it was, Common Core State Standards Initiative. And most of us didn't have any idea where this was coming from. I don't know about you, but when I heard No Child Left Behind, I go, oh, that's wonderful. Don't leave no child behind. But they were talking about something totally different. Don't leave any child out of the indoctrination that we want to put them through. And so then we start seeing the schools stunt children's growth. This is John Gatto. He was a 1990 Teacher of the Year. He said, schools are not a place to grow up. They won't let you. In 49 years, 19 as a student, and 30 as a teacher, I was seldom asked to be responsible, but primarily to be obedient to strangers who may even ask me to violate the core principles of my household. Are we all recognizing the environment that we're living in now? They don't want our children to mature. They don't want them to grow up. And they want them to totally disregard what could be your core values at home. And they want to change that to take your values and your morals and your ethics out of the children and replace it with their own. With their own. Hercules' wife, this is Sam Sorbo. Her husband is the guy who played Hercules. Says schools by action of many state and federal officials are declared not essential. Government schools teach today, don't ask, don't try, don't think. Look at how they've crippled our children. Look at how they've crippled our society. There's no intellectual curiosity. We don't ask. There's no effort. There's no ambition. We don't try to do anything except what someone has laid out for us. We're living in the most entitled generation I've ever seen in my life. You know, it's almost like if you don't do it for me, it's not going to get done, but you owe it to me to do it for me. I'm not going to even try. And then this part is don't think. We are totally a society without thinking people. That's why we're so easily manipulated with emotions and all of the okey-doke that comes down because we don't think. If we would take a few minutes to just think about some of the things we hear on CNN, we would say that doesn't make any sense. It's not rational. It's not practical. No, I don't believe that. There's not in one moment. 5 minutes, so I got to really hurry. So this has been the outcome of that. We have this new world generation as a result of what has been going on in the school system. Today, 70% of millennials say that they are likely to vote socialist. 70% of millennials say they are like, didn't we almost have a socialist president? If Hillary Clinton hadn't cheated Bernie Sanders, he would have won that primary, and there's a good chance that he would have won the election. We would have elected somebody who identified himself as a socialist. 36% of millennials view communism as favorable. That's unimaginable to me. And I ask people everywhere I go, can you point to me one country, one nation, one society that has been successful and prosperous under communism? Millennials are now the first non-Christian majority in U.S. history. I'm saying all of this is a result of the government school system. Is that we're in favor of socialism, we're open to communism, and we're rejecting church. These millennials with the thumb down are basically indicating to us that they are rejecting every tradition, every principle, every value that we've ever held dear in the country. They're rejecting any ethical norms that we had. All of those are down because this is a new day. And one that hurts me as a preacher is that we have the first non-Christian majority in history. Church membership falls below majority for the first time in history. Only 47% of Americans say that they belong to church, synagogue, or mosque. 50% in 2018, 1999, 70%, and 80% in 1937. We're going to talk about the detestable sexualization of our children through comprehensive sex. That's a scripture that talks about how we are to teach our children about sex and how to have sexual morality. But look at what they're teaching them in our schools. In 2013, Illinois passed a law to require any school that offers sex education to only use the comprehensive sex curriculum that contains pornographic images that were too graphic to show on the floor of the United States Congress. This is a book called It's Perfectly Normal. And it is perfectly normal. And this is a book that's in school systems. It's in libraries. And the images that they put in this book and put before children are too graphic to be shown on the floor of the United States House of Representatives. And if I was standing outside passing out these photos, I would be arrested, and rightfully so. But yet you're telling me this is okay to teach my 4th grade children? And just last year, Illinois passed HB 818, and now says we can teach this all the way down to kindergarten. All the way down, they are sexualizing our children, and not only sexualizing them, they're sexualizing them with perversity. They're trying to sexualize our children and get them active. And there are some people who have a vested interest in that. Planned Parenthood Federation and all those individuals are interested in your children becoming sexually active because they have a financial investment in it. They say the more I can get you to have sex when you're young, the more mistakes you're going to make, the more abortions that you can have. They're also grooming children for certain behavior. So first of all, I want to ask you, what do you notice about the children? They're meditating. They're meditating. In some school districts, not only do they meditate, they only hit bells for Buddhism, they roll out the prayer rugs, and they pray to Allah, but you cannot have in most schools a Christian. But then look on the shelf. Somebody said earlier about you put images in front of children, attach stories into it, because who likes storybooks more than children? We all like them. We learn many of our values reading storybooks coming up. But look at the books on the shelf. It's Perfectly Normal. That's the one I just showed you. Heather Has Two Mommies. You guys know about that one. King and King family and King and King. You guys know the story of King and King? There was a prince. And the prince's parents said, look, you're going to be the king one day. It's time that you go out and find a wife. Because in order for you to be the king, we must have a queen. You need to get married. Go find someone that you can marry and fall in love with. The prince set out to find his love, and he met another prince. And they hit it off. And they fell in love with one another. And not only did they fall in love, they got married to one another. And so that when he became the king, it was no longer king and queen. It was king and king. These are the values, these are the things that they're trying to put into our children. If I had time, I was going to show you a short video clip called The War on Children. I encourage you to go on to YouTube and you can pull that up. It's a 10-minute video, but it talks about the disciples of Alfred Kinsey. The people who are teaching sex education in our schools are disciples of Alfred Kinsey. Everybody know who Alfred Kinsey is, right? Here's an individual that was so sick and depraved that he was doing sexual exercises on infants, trying to see how many orgasms you can produce in a 6-month-old. I'm telling you the truth, right? Just think about it. And this is the individual who wrote the books, who set the precedents in place, that now sex education teachers are coming along. These are disciples of Kinsey, and you think I want you to teach my child about sexuality? No way. No way. So not only are they being sexualized, not only are they being misled, but the failure rate in schools is abysmal. This is from the Illinois report card. 32% of students meet or exceed grade level proficiency in math. Only 32. 38% in English. 49% or less than half in science. Yet these school districts are passing 95% of the children. How is that possible? How are we giving diplomas to children who can't even read it? Because the goal was never to educate your children. You've heard it from their own mouths. They would never want to educate your children. They wanted to indoctrinate your children. They wanted to turn your children into little models of how they perceive they're going to be needed in order to be able to bring their agenda into play. They wanted to make your children submissive, subversive. They want their children to reject you and your leadership because they paint you as the enemy. I got to protect you from your parents. If you want to get an abortion, your parent don't need to know. We'll take you to get the abortion. You want to change your gender? Just tell us. We'll help you do it. They want to separate them out because they want to create something in your children that you never intended. The government school is no place for your children to be. You really need to find an alternative. We think that it's beyond repair. It's working exactly as it was designed to work. And we can no longer continue to let our children be sacrificed on the altar of the New World Order. We have to set our children free if we're ever going to be able to save our nation. They've taught to hate our country. Have you noticed this? Kids are coming out of schools and universities being taught to hate your country. I challenge them all the time, where would you rather live? We'll help you get there, but you think about it before you go. What country is better for us right now than America? How is it that you're taught to hate the place that is giving you access to so much? Well, the man is keeping me down. No, you're keeping yourself down. But the man has contributed because he has taught you how to think about yourself. He's programmed you what to think about yourself. We have to set our children's minds free. We have to help them learn to think. We have to awaken the curiosity within them. We have to reinstill a love for God and a love for country into our children. And we have to teach our children to stand up and be the individual person that God has created them to be. Not the creation of somebody in Rio de Janeiro, but who God has intended for them to be. And we can no longer sit idly by. Because what God makes you aware of, he holds you responsible for. We've got to go and let everybody know. Thank you all so much. I'm sorry this went too long.